At the top of one of Chicago's wealthiest neighborhoods stood the magnificent Whitmore mansion, a towering estate surrounded by iron gates, marble fountains, and acres of perfectly trimmed gardens. To everyone who passed by, it represented success, power, and old American wealth. Inside those walls, however, kindness was nowhere to be found. 26-year-old Amara Johnson quietly polished the grand staircase every morning before sunrise. She was a young black woman with warm brown eyes, natural curls tied neatly beneath a scarf, and a gentle smile she rarely showed anymore. For nearly 3 years, Amara had worked as the Whitmore family's maid. Every single day brought another insult. "Watch where you're walking," snapped Victoria Whitmore, the elegant but cold-hearted matriarch, as Amara accidentally brushed past her while carrying fresh towels. "You people are always so careless." Amara lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. "Sorry doesn't clean marble floors." Nearby, Victoria's son Ethan Whitmore, a handsome businessman in expensive suits, laughed loudly. "Mom, you're expecting too much. She's just the help." The dining room erupted in laughter. Amara silently continued working. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. Every meal became another opportunity for humiliation. The family never allowed her to eat with the other staff. Instead, she was given leftovers after everyone finished. One afternoon, Ethan deliberately knocked a crystal glass onto the floor. The expensive glass shattered into hundreds of pieces. He looked directly at Amara. "Clean it." Without saying another word, she knelt to collect the broken glass. As she reached for one sharp piece, it sliced deeply into her finger. Blood slowly dripped onto the polished marble. Instead of helping, Victoria sighed with annoyance. "Oh, wonderful. Now she's bleeding on my floor." The family laughed again. Amara quietly wrapped her hand in a napkin before continuing to clean. Not one person asked if she was okay. Not one. Only the elderly gardener, Mr. Lewis, offered her a sympathetic glance later that afternoon. "They don't deserve your kindness," he whispered. Amara smiled softly. "Maybe one day they'll learn." Mr. Lewis shook his head. "I doubt people like that ever change." If only he knew the truth. Every Friday evening after finishing her work, Amara boarded a city bus instead of taking the staff shuttle. She traveled across town to visit a modest law office. The receptionist greeted her warmly. "Good evening, Miss Johnson." "Good evening." Moments later, Attorney Charles Bennett welcomed her into his office. He smiled. "Everything remains exactly as planned." Amara nodded. "No one suspects anything?" "Not even a little." Charles opened a thick folder filled with legal documents. Inside were ownership certificates, corporate records, bank statements, trust agreements. Every page carried one name: Amara Johnson. The Whitmores believed they owned everything. The mansion, Whitmore Hotels, Whitmore Construction, millions in investments, luxury vehicles, private accounts. But legally, none of it belonged to them anymore. Charles adjusted his glasses. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man." Amara smiled sadly. "So was my mother." 25 years earlier, Amara's grandfather, Benjamin Carter, had been the brilliant financial partner who secretly rescued the Whitmore empire from bankruptcy. Without him, the Whitmores would have lost everything. Instead of gratitude, they cheated him, forged documents, forced him out, destroyed his reputation. Benjamin spent years quietly rebuilding his fortune. He never sought revenge. Instead, he created something smarter. A trust. One impossible to challenge. When Benjamin passed away, ownership transferred first to Amara's mother. After her mother's death, everything legally became Amara's. But there was one unusual condition. She could not claim control until spending at least 3 years working anonymously inside the Whitmore household. Benjamin wanted to know one thing. Had the family changed? Or were they still the same cruel people who betrayed him decades earlier? 3 years later, Amara had her answer. Charles looked at her carefully. "The waiting period ends next Friday." She took a slow breath. "So it's finally time." He smiled. "They'll never see it coming." Back at the mansion, preparations were underway for Victoria Whitmore's extravagant charity gala. Over 200 wealthy guests would attend. Television reporters, politicians, business executives, everyone important. Victoria barked orders all morning. Amara. Yes, ma'am. The silverware isn't shining. It is polished. Victoria inspected one spoon. I can still see fingerprints. There aren't any. Victoria dropped the spoon onto the floor. Do it again. For the next 4 hours, Amara polished every piece of silver a second time. That evening the family gathered around the enormous dining table. Ethan raised a champagne glass. Next week we finalize the acquisition of another luxury hotel. His father Richard Whitmore grinned proudly. Our empire keeps growing. Victoria smiled confidently. The Whitmore name will dominate this city forever. Standing silently nearby, Amara almost smiled. Not because she believed them. Because she knew exactly what would happen in 7 days. The following morning something unexpected happened. A courier arrived carrying a sealed envelope marked confidential. Richard frowned. What is this? Inside was a formal legal notice. It informed him that certain corporate ownership records would undergo mandatory verification the following Friday. Richard laughed. Lawyers love paperwork. He tossed the letter aside. No concern. Across the room, Amara quietly continued dusting the bookshelf. She already knew who had sent it. The countdown had begun. Days passed. The Whitmores became increasingly excited about their expanding fortune. Meanwhile, Amara calmly watched everything. She memorized every insult, every cruel joke, every act of arrogance. Not out of hatred, but because each moment reminded her why her grandfather had written that strange condition into his will. On Thursday night, the final evening before everything changed, Mr. Lewis found Amara sitting alone in the garden beneath an old oak tree. You seem different. She smiled gently. Tomorrow is my last day. He looked surprised. You found another job? She stared toward the glowing mansion. No. I finally get to go home. He didn't understand. But somehow, he smiled anyway. Inside the mansion, the Whitmores toasted another successful year. They laughed, celebrated, dreamed about becoming even richer, completely unaware that legally, every brick above their heads, every dollar in their bank accounts, every luxury car in their garage, already belonged to the young black maid they mocked every single day, and by tomorrow afternoon, their entire world would collapse. Friday morning arrived like any other. The Whitmore family woke to fresh coffee, perfectly pressed clothes and a spotless mansion. Amara quietly carried out her usual duties, making beds, polishing mirrors and setting the breakfast table. To the Whitmores she was invisible. To Amara, every passing minute brought her closer to the truth her grandfather had waited decades to reveal. At precisely 10 o'clock the mansion's front gate opened. 3 black luxury sedans rolled onto the driveway. Richard Whitmore glanced out the window. Who on earth is visiting without an appointment? Moments later the butler entered. Sir, there are several attorneys here. They insist it's urgent. Richard frowned. Send them in. Within seconds 6 sharply dressed lawyers entered the grand living room. Leading them was Charles Bennett, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Victoria crossed her arms. I hope this won't take long. Charles remained calm. It depends on how quickly you understand today's documents. Richard smirked. This is about yesterday's verification notice, isn't it? It is. Charles carefully placed several folders on the marble coffee table. Mr. Whitmore, before we begin, I need every member of your household present. Victoria looked irritated. Why would our maid need to hear this? Charles looked directly at Amara. Because she is the most important person in this room. Silence filled the mansion. Ethan burst into laughter. Our maid? That's the funniest thing I've heard all year. Charles didn't smile. Miss Johnson, would you please join us? Amara calmly removed her cleaning gloves and stepped forward. For the first time in 3 years she stood beside the Whitmores instead of behind them. Richard's smile faded. Charles opened the first folder. I represent the Carter Family Trust. Richard shrugged. Never heard of it. You have, Charles replied. You simply didn't know its name. He slid several ownership certificates across the table. Richard picked one up. His confident expression slowly disappeared. No. He grabbed another. Then another. His hands began shaking. Victoria leaned over his shoulder. What is it? Richard whispered. Our mansion. Charles nodded. Legally belongs to Miss Amara Johnson. Victoria laughed nervously. That's impossible. Charles calmly produced the original deed. Recorded 22 years ago. Ethan snatched another document. Our hotel company. Charles nodded again. Owned by the Carter Family Trust. Our construction company? The same. Our investment accounts? Also included. Our private shares? Transferred years ago. Richard stared in disbelief. This has to be fraud. Charles quietly placed one final document before him. The ruling from the federal court confirming every transfer. Richard's face turned pale. It was all legal? Completely. Victoria looked at Amara as if seeing her for the first time. You knew. Amara answered softly. Yes. For how long? My entire life. The room became painfully silent. Charles continued. 25 years ago, Benjamin Carter rescued the Whitmore family from financial ruin. Instead of honoring your agreement, you forced him out using forged documents. Richard couldn't speak. Victoria slowly sat down. Charles continued. Benjamin Carter rebuilt his fortune quietly. He purchased every debt. Every investment. Every share. Every mortgage. Every holding company. And because he believed true character reveals itself through power. Charles looked toward Amara. He required his granddaughter to spend 3 years living among the Whitmores before claiming ownership. Victoria stared at Amara. You were testing us? Amara's eyes filled with sadness. No. My grandfather was. And sadly, you failed. Every cruel memory rushed back into the room. The broken glass. The insults. The leftovers. The laughter. The humiliation. None of it could be erased. Ethan suddenly stepped forward. This is ridiculous. She cleaned our bathrooms. Amara looked directly into his eyes. Yes. And every day you reminded me you believed that made me less than you. Charles handed Richard another envelope. There is one final notice. Richard slowly opened it. His face turned white. What? His voice trembled. We're being removed? Charles nodded. As of 5 o'clock today, your right to occupy this property ends. Victoria gasped. You can't throw us out. I can, Amara said quietly. But I won't. Everyone looked at her in surprise. Richard could barely speak. What do you mean? Amara took a deep breath. My grandfather taught me that revenge should never destroy innocent people. I'm giving each of you 90 days to find a new home. Victoria began crying. You'd still help us, after everything? Amara answered honestly. I'm helping myself. I refuse to become the kind of person you were. For the first time in decades, no one had an answer. Over the next several weeks, newspapers across Chicago exploded with the unbelievable story. Maid revealed as true owner of Whitmore Empire. The story spread nationwide. Former employees came forward with stories of mistreatment. Old court records proved Benjamin Carter had been cheated years before. Public opinion turned completely against the Whitmores. Major investors withdrew their support. Business partners walked away. Not because Amara demanded it, but because the truth had finally surfaced. One afternoon, Mr. Lewis stood once again beneath the old oak tree in the mansion garden. Only now, Amara wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a simple navy blue business suit. You look different, he smiled. Amara laughed softly. I finally feel like myself. You always were. With her new authority, Amara transformed the Whitmore companies. The first changes shocked everyone. Every employee received fair wages. Healthcare benefits improved. Scholarship programs were created for children of staff members. Paid family leave became standard. The servants' basement quarters were completely renovated into comfortable apartments. She even established the Benjamin Carter Foundation, helping hardworking families start businesses, attend college, and buy their first homes. People who once feared going to work now felt respected. Months later, Amara received an unexpected visitor. Victoria Whitmore. She looked older. Humbler. Gone were the designer dresses and expensive jewelry. She quietly stood at the office door. I don't expect forgiveness. Amara remained silent. Victoria continued. I spent my whole life believing wealth made people valuable. I was wrong. Tears filled her eyes. You had every reason to hate us. Amara looked out the window before answering. Hate would only keep me trapped in the same prison you lived in. Victoria lowered her head. I'm truly sorry. For a long moment neither woman spoke. Finally, Amara nodded. I accept your apology. But trust has to be earned. Victoria quietly smiled through tears. I understand. As she walked away, Amara realized something important. The greatest victory wasn't taking back the mansion. It wasn't reclaiming the business. It wasn't becoming wealthy. Her greatest victory was proving that dignity cannot be taken from someone who refuses to surrender it. The Whitmores had spent years believing power came from money. Benjamin Carter had known better. Real power came from integrity. Months later, a bronze plaque was placed at the entrance of the estate. Read, "This home stands because one honest man refused to let injustice have the final word. In honor of Benjamin Carter, and in celebration of kindness, dignity, and truth." Every morning, employees passed that plaque on their way to work. They smiled, knowing the mansion no longer belonged to a family that ruled through arrogance. It belonged to a woman who had once quietly mopped its floors, endured endless humiliation, and answered cruelty not with revenge alone, but with justice, compassion, and the courage to break a cycle of greed that had lasted for generations.